In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to build a pedometer app that tracks your steps and how far you've moved. You can see that if I click the start button here, then it will start recording my steps, my distance, and the time that's passed. So as I walk around here, my steps are increasing and my distance does as well. Then I can hit stop and reset and start walking again. I've pulled up a new project here that I've titled Pedometer, and we'll first look at the design review for what we're going to put on the screen. So I'm going to start this off just with a label at the top, introducing the user to what the app is. So I'm going to drag a label over from here, and the property that I'm going to change on the right side is in the text. So instead of text for label 1, we can make it something informative related to pedometers. I'm just going to say, what time is it? Walking time. And then below that, I'm going to put a start and reset button so that the user can control when the pedometer is in use. So that I can arrange my buttons nicely, I'm going to get a layout component, which is under here, and I'll choose a horizontal arrangement, meaning that we'll have two buttons that are side by side. So I'll pull this down here and go back to user interface, and then I'm going to drag in two buttons that I'll put right next to each other. So I'll put the first one right there, and the second one to its right. Just like with the label, we'll want to change the text on these to make it more informative. I'm going to make the first one be the start button, so I'm going to the properties and then changing the text to start. And then button 2 will be our reset button. Alright, and you might be wondering why we don't have a stop button. What I'm going to do once we get into the coding component is change this button so that once the user presses start, then it becomes a stop button and vice versa. And then the distinction between stop and reset is stop means that we're stopping the pedometer, and reset means we're going to clear all of the metrics that we've collected so far. Now below these, we want to actually display those metrics as the user is walking around. Now I'm going to get another layout for those, and I'm going to make it a table arrangement so we can have both rows and columns. We want to display the time, steps, and distance below each other. In order to do that, we'll need to have 3 rows. We can see that this one is currently set to 2, so I'm going to change that to 3. And now we can put in our labels. So we're going to have 6 labels in total. I'm just going to drag those in. We want the labels on the left to show what the value is. So I'm going to make the first one time, changing that under text. And then so that the user knows what units it's in, I'm going to specify that this is in minutes. Then the next one is going to show the number of steps the user has walked. So I'm going to put that here. And then this one is going to be the distance. And again, we'll want to specify the units, and we're going to make that meters because that's the default. On the right, once we start calculating values, these are going to show the minutes, steps, and distance, but for now I'm just going to set these all to be 0 as they should be in the beginning before anything has happened. Okay, lastly, we need to think about the other components that we'll need to have behind the scenes here, and for that we're going to go under sensors. First, of course, we're going to need the pedometer, and that's right here with the little footprints. I'm going to drag that onto the screen, and you'll see that it goes under non-visible components because we can't see anything on the screen indicating that it's there, but this will allow us, once we get into the coding portion, to access its properties. We're also going to want the clock, and that's so that we can update the time regularly. So I'm going to drag that on. Before we go over to blocks, one more thing I want to do is to give these labels more descriptive names so that once we're in the coding portion, we'll know what they're referring to. We only really care about these 3 labels here because those are the ones we're going to be changing. So I'm going to change their names. So instead of label 3, we can call this time. Instead of label 5, we can call this steps. And then instead of label 7, this will become distance. Similarly for button 1 and button 2, I'm going to name this one start, stop, because it's going to represent both. And then button 2 is going to be reset. Alright, so let's go to the coding portion by looking at blocks here. First of all, let's think about what happens when the user clicks our start button. So first we need to detect when that happens. And to get the block that controls that, I'm going to click on start stop. The first one there is when start stop dot click. Now, there are two possibilities we have to consider here. One is they've clicked this button when it's in its start mode, and one is when we've clicked it and it's in its stop mode. And because those are two very different cases we have to consider, we're going to need an if clause to handle those. And that's found under control, and we want the second one here because this allows for both an if and else statement. That is two different options, which is what we're dealing with. So I'm going to put that in there. Let's first think about the case when it is in the start mode. And we can tell that by looking at the text that's on the button and seeing if that is equal to just the text start. So to get the text on the button, we can look under its properties. And sure enough, there's the start-stop.text option. Make sure you get the light green one rather than dark green because dark green is for changing the text and light green is just for accessing what's already there. So we want to look at the text that's on the button and compare that to just the text start to see if they're equal. To get the text, we're going to go under text, and at the top here is just empty quotes. It's empty now, but we can put text inside, and I'm going to make it start. Now all we have to do to see if it's in start mode is to compare if these two are equal. And comparisons tend to be a logic thing, so I'm going to go to logic and get the equal sign. Now all we need to do is connect these. So I'm going to put that there, and then snap these two into the two comparison slots. So now we have a way to check if our button currently says start. What do we want to do if the user clicks start? Well, first we want to kickstart our pedometer because even though we had it on the screen before, it's not actually doing anything yet unless we tell it to. So we're going to find where the pedometer is over here, and we want to call pedometer1.start, meaning we tell it to start counting steps. So I'll bring that in here. Now we also need to change the text on this button, so instead of start, it now says stop. Before we use this light green option to tell what the text is, but now we actually want the dark green equivalent. So I'm going to find that here. Here we go. And this time we're going to change it to say stop. And just like we got the text for start here, we can also get it for stop up here. The last thing we need to do upon starting is also start our clock component. And this is because we were showing the time on the screen and we want to regularly update the time each time a minute passes. And in order to do that, we have to set a timer using our clock that fires every minute, telling us, hey, it's time to update that time that we're displaying. So to do that, let's look what our options are under clock. Scrolling down to the bottom, what we want is setClock1.timerInterval, and that defines the amount of time that passes in between each time the timer goes off. And that's what we want to have control over, so we can set that to go once a minute. So I'm going to pull this down. And then the timer actually expresses itself in terms of milliseconds, whereas we want it in minutes. And there's 60,000 milliseconds in a minute, so we need a math number component that is set to 60,000. So we've covered the case if the user wants to start the pedometer. Let's consider the case where they want to stop the pedometer. And we know that the only two things the start-stop button are ever going to say are start and stop. So if we reach this else clause, that means it doesn't say start, which means it must say stop. The first thing we want to do is to set the text on the timer to say start so that the user can now restart the timer after it's been stopped. So this is going to be very similar to what we did right here, and I think you all can do that. This is getting the set text component, and then getting another text box. And this is just going to say start. Then, just as we started the pedometer here, we now want to stop it. And we can go down to the pedometer to find that and get stop. Alright, so we've set up the pedometer, everything's ready to go, and everything's now being recorded behind the scenes, but then the question is, how can we show that to the user? We set up those nice labels in our designer view so that we can display the output very easily. Let's start off with the time. So we know that we want to update the time feature every time another minute passes, and we have our timer ready to go for that. So now all we need to do to determine when to update the timer is let's go under clock 1, and then the first one here, when clock1.timer, just means when the timer goes off, which is going to be once a minute for us. So I'll bring this down, and what we want to do when the timer goes off is set the label in our time text box to be the new time. So we want to set the label in time. Now we can be glad that we gave it a nice name instead of label 3. And we want to set its text, which is right here. We're going to get our time from our pedometer because that's one of the things it keeps track of. So if we go down to the pedometer, we can see there's an option for pedometer1.elapsed time. Now, just as our clock accepted time in terms of milliseconds, our pedometer also records it in terms of milliseconds, and that's not going to be very helpful to display to the user because we don't really think in terms of milliseconds. Because we know from over here that 1 minute represents 60,000 milliseconds, so because this gives us the time in milliseconds, we just need to divide by 60,000 to get back the time in minutes. We're going to find the operation for that under math. There's the division component here. So we'll put our time in the first one, and then the second slot is just going to hold 60,000. Okay, and that's all we need to do when the timer goes off. Now we also want to update those other two fields, which were the steps that we've walked and the distance that we've traveled. And it makes sense to update those every time the user takes another step, because that's the only case when the steps or the distance are going to change. There's an option that detects that under pedometers. We'll click on that. And we have two options here for detecting steps. One is simple step and one is walk step. The difference between these is that simple step takes any kind of time it looks like the phone is moving in a pattern that suggests a step. Walk step requires that not only is the phone kind of bouncing up and down, but it's also moving forward. And so this is going to be a little bit more accurate of a measure of steps, so that if you're just like kind of bouncing yourself up and down, it's not going to count. We're going to bring down this one. And then what's promising is it already has both the steps and the distance ready to go there. We just need to put them into our labels. So let's get the blocks that will let us change those. Let's go to steps and then choose steps.text. And then we'll want the same for distance. So I'll go to distance and get set the text. And we just want to set them to these nice properties that they've already calculated for us. You'll see if we mouse over one of these, it will have a ready to go get box for us. So I'm going to put that here and then do the same for distance. Okay, so what we have now will totally work if we only want to run this once, but if we take one walk and then we want to go on another, we want to clear the progress that we've made after the first one. So that's where our reset button comes in. Let's first tell if the reader has clicked it. So we're going to get when reset.click. First, let's reset our pedometer so that it starts from scratch. So I'm going to go under pedometer and choose call reset. And then we want to set those labels back to be 0. So let's get our set text for those three. We'll get time, steps, and distance. And put these all under here. And we just want to set them to 0 like we had on the original screen. So I'll go to math and just get 3 of the number 0. And that's it. You've built your pedometer app. Now you can go test it out on a walk.